Hello everybody, my name's Clare Brown. I'm the Curator of Natural Science for Leeds Museums and Galleries. I look after our 800,000 natural science specimens. So that's everything from dried herbs and plants to stuffed animals and everything in between. I look after the Leeds tiger at the City Museum, for example. To tie in with what you guys are interested in, I have written a talk about the natural history of abbeys. So what might be growing on abbeys and ruins and castles and things like that, because there's an awful lot of wildlife that takes advantage of abbey walls and their surroundings. So I'm just going to start this going and I can have a chat with you about it. See if this works. We're going to go ahead. Yeah, great. All right. So I've called this Growing on History, the natural history of abbeys, castles and ruins. And I have to say, this is so strange. I wish I was there in person chatting to you all rather than recording this on a computer to myself in my kitchen. Let's see how we get on. The sun's coming round a bit. Fudge around. Okay, right. So abbeys, as you can imagine, are fantastic spots for wildlife because they replicate all sorts of different environments that you might find in life. So mainly cliff faces, perhaps quarries and rubbles and rubble screes and things like that. But also around an abbey, particularly Kirkstall, you've got other habitats like the river and woodland and all sorts of things. Some abbeys are quite remote, especially castles and things like that. And so you might find a nice woodland around them. And so lots of animals are getting interested in using the castle or abbey as a habitat, but also perhaps visiting it to hunt or something like that. Okay, so this is a picture of Tintern Abbey down in Monmouthshire, and of course it's got the classic 18th century romantic landscape idea of covering everything in ivy, and modern practices in terms of keeping walls free of vegetation are nuanced, to say the least. So there's lots of different ways of looking after things growing on walls in abbeys, but certainly in the 18th century then they were, or 19th century in this case, then they were sort of used as a romantic backdrop for all sorts of things. And this is a romanticized sort of artistic license version of ivy growing all over the pillars at Tintern, and you can just see the extent of the ivy growing up those pillars. Now I'm going to talk first about ivy because it's sort of the most obvious thing you will find growing all over the walls. I absolutely love ivy. I think it's completely fantastic for wildlife for lots of different reasons. So it looks as if it's completely colonized that abbey and is covering all those pillars and might cause some damage, but actually ivy doesn't cause damage to anything unless it finds a crack in a roof tile or something like that, or rooftop that it would get into and put a shoot in and then start expanding in it. That's the only time it would ever cause any damage. Other than that, it doesn't actually physically affect any of the stonework that it's growing on. It doesn't dissolve it or anything. It just uses it as a sort of support, as a point to sort of attach itself to it, and otherwise it doesn't damage at all. The Woodland Trust do say that there is some evidence that older trees might be affected by wind throw. So if a large tree is covered in a huge amount of ivy, then obviously that's a great deal of area for wind to come and pick it up and throw it over. But that tends to be older trees, and in general it's encouraging woodland because it actually increases the surface area of the woodland. Ivy is also amazing because it is one of the latest flowers in the year. So late autumn, early winter, ivy is still flowering, and that means that there's lots of really quite nectar-rich flowers for late insects to be taking advantage of. So it's really helpful for helping insects and other things survive through the winter. And then it's one of the earliest berry bearing plants. So again, late winter, early spring, the berries are forming, the little black buds that you see, or blackberries that you see all over them. And again, they're a vital lifeline for getting through the winter for many birds and lots of other species, because they're really, really a great source of food in pretty lean times. So ivy is absolutely fantastic in that respect. It's also brilliant in terms of shelter and protection. In terms of growing on abbeys and things like that, then it actually, there's some evidence that it protects walls from wind erosion and damp and things like that. The evidence is not in exactly how beneficial that is, but in terms of everything else, it's considered a reasonable thing to have growing all over your walls. The one proviso with that is that if you start stripping it off, then you've got problems, because it does anchor itself so firmly to the walls that actually it can be quite damaging to start removing it. So balancing all that together is something that someone who's looking after an abbey or a castle needs to think about. But on the whole, for wildlife, ivy is just completely fantastic. And also, one of the other things I found out when looking into ivy is that I hadn't realised that the Ivy League universities in North America are called Ivy League universities because they're all so covered in ivy. I'm not sure if that's this species, the helix, or whether it's Boston ivy or Virginia creeper. I imagine it's those rather than our ivy, but that's why they're called Ivy League universities. There we go. Okay, so I'm a big ivy fan. But we're going to move on now to look at lichen. So lichen is not at all like ivy. It's not even a plant. Lichen is absolutely incredible. It's a symbiotic relationship between a fungus and either a cyanobacteria or an algae. And so what happens is the fungus will anchor itself to the stonework or wherever it's deciding to grow, and then it incorporates in with it either cyanobacteria or algae to do some photosynthesizing. So the fungus will slightly digest the stonework and use all the minerals from the stones, and then the algae will photosynthesize and sort of make sugar or fix sugars for the whole organism to survive. So lichen isn't really, it's not one species, it's two usually working together. It's called mutualism or symbiotic relationship, but there's some evidence that actually a fungi might be taking a bit of advantage of the algae, because as soon as the algae makes these sugars, the fungi changes them into a sugar that only fungi can access. So it's a bit mean, but they seem to get on all right. They've been doing it for many, many years. So go back, yes. So lichen, again, can be slightly destructive. So it does actually dissolve the substrate that it's living on in some cases, not all, but in most, or the ones that have been studied. And so there is some worry that it might be damaging the stonework underneath. However, it also might offer some protection. It's also absolutely fabulous for dating things. So if you know, lichen can be particularly slow growing. So if you know you've got a particular size algal patch, lichen patch on some stonework, then you might be able to say, well, that stonework's definitely been there for X amount of years. And also there's quite a lot of lichen wars that go on with different species and types overlapping each other and covering each other in different ways. So if you've got a newer part of an abbey, then you can date it by looking at how its lichen is different to the older parts of the abbey. So lichen's absolutely fantastic in that respect. And also you get different lichen on different substrates. So it can help you also look at what kind of rock your abbey might be built out of, and also where it came from and a bit more about its history. It just adds to the layers of information that you can get about the history of an abbey. It's also worth mentioning that lichen are excellent indicators of pollution. So on the whole, if you've got lichen growing somewhere, then it tends to be that it's a low pollution area. So if you've got any in your local park or in your back of your garden away from the road, that's a good indicator that the air quality is pretty good. Okay. So obviously there's loads of other things that live on the walls of abbeys and castles. This is a photo from historic England of all the sorts of things that might be growing there. So some speedwell, ivy leaf, toad, flax and other bits and pieces, just exploiting every nook and cranny. These are usually cliff specialists. So they have wind-blown seeds that get into cracks and can exploit any sort of tiny bit of soil or nutrients in there. So all sorts of things growing on the walls of abbeys. On the right is ivy leaf toad flax, and I included this its Latin is, or its scientific name is Cymbellaria muralis, and of course muralis means wall, so it was even named because of its habit of growing in walls. It's absolutely a wall specialist. And on the left-hand side is a really interesting project they're doing across historic England, looking at soft capping ruins. So if you've got a wall that was never meant to be exposed to the elements, for example, a ruined abbey wall, wasn't expecting Henry VIII to come along, then you need to protect it in some way. Hard capping is where you put tiles and cement over the top of it, keep it nice and protected. But a problem with that is it's incredibly, well, it's expensive, it's destructive, it's intrusive, and it's also pretty difficult to remove. So Historic England have been experimenting with soft capping walls, which is where you plant grasses and other bits of vegetation to try and protect the tops of the walls. And I think as far as I can make out, it's going quite well. So it's less expensive, less destructive, less invasive, and it does seem to protect masonry from weathering, which is obviously a huge advantage if you're looking after a derelict abbey. Okay, and also there are plenty of things living in the vegetation, of course. So again, a lot of these are cliff and quarry and rubble specialists. So they're interested in sort of those environments and the vegetation that grows on them. On the left is a little mirrored bug that we have in the collections that was collected in Kirkstall. All sorts of invertebrates love, especially ivy, but all sorts of different environments that are special to cliffs and abbeys and castles. It obviously provides lots of nesting sites, sources of rare minerals, shelter, vegetation, cover, unusual environments, and that kind of thing. There's a little white-lipped snail under there. You might see them around if you're ever around an abbey or a castle growing in the vegetation. I absolutely love this little drawing of by an ecologist called Lucia Jurokova. Sorry about my pronunciation, Lucia. She went round and looked at 123 European castles for the snails that were growing on them, and she found that a few species are more common on castle ruins than they are in nature, and one of them, Lapicola, even means stone killer. So obviously really enjoying their time on castles and on abbeys, and there's a little drawing of them on the left. One of them is pretty small, the real size of an adult punctum pygmaeum on the left hand side. It's pretty tiny, but you know, every species counts. So it's really nice to hear that they're growing on castles. And of course, there are lots of other things that are slightly larger than invertebrates growing on castles. So there's a slow worm in the top left-hand corner, and they obviously exploit the wonderful amounts of open spaces to bask and heat up in the sun on the rock faces. A mining bee in the bottom will definitely make homes in softer rock like sandstones and things like that, or in the mortar between the rocks, the stones that are used to build an abbey or a castle. And then one of the things you'll often see on the walls in and around any wall really, because they like hunting in the sunshine, are the little tiny, very cute jumping spiders. These things are absolutely adorable. If you go up to them on a wall, I mean, they're really, really tiny, sort of, you know, smaller than a pea, or same size as a pea, I suppose, the big ones. But if you go up to them, they'll actually move their heads and look at you and check you out. They have these incredible eyes in the top of their heads. So if you can see on that picture, they've got these great big binocular eyes, and those eyes don't, they're not eyeballs. They're not the same size as the same sort of ratio as ours. They actually extend right back into that head, like binoculars. They've got fantastic vision. They can see absolutely brilliantly, because that's what they rely on to hunt. They're not web spinners. They actually go out hunting for insects on the walls. Okay, moving on to even larger things that you might find in and around a castle ruin. So these are the pellets of the birds that are written on there. So when a bird catches a vole or a fish or anything like that, they swallow it down into their gizzard, and then it spends quite a long, this is a bit gross, it spends quite a long time in there getting dissolved by enzymes and all sorts of things. And slowly digested, and then that sort of the soupy bit of that carries on into the bird's digestive system, fine. But then everything that's left, so all the fur and the feathers and the bones and the beaks, or whatever they've got inside that sort of the vole that they've swallowed whole, they don't pass back into their digestive system. They regurgitate it as a pellet. So a bit gross, but actually pellets, when they come out, they're black and they dry sort of grey, so you'll be able to see them. And they generally don't smell. They're not feces, they're not droppings or anything. It's just the little bits left over from digestion by a bird. It's not in their interest to smell. They want everything that's good, that would be digestible, to go into their digestive system. So these come out quite clean, and they are really good indicators that you've got something interesting living on your castle or your abbey. So if you've got thorny owls, and you can look at the pellets of thorny owls, often at the bottom of a roost where they're sitting. Obviously kestrels a bit small and the barn owls a bit bigger, and also jackdaws are also regurgitating stuff, and they're not meat specialists, they're omnivores. They eat all sorts of different things, so you'll find different bits and pieces in those pellets should you want to go looking through them. And if you get hold of an owl pellet, then you can actually have a really good idea of what's living in and around a place, because everywhere that the owl will be hunting, obviously these creatures are living, and if you extract what's in the pellets, then you can work out the populations of, or the health of the environment around it. So obviously if you get 3 different skulls in a pellet, then the barn owl's done quite well in eating 3 shrews or something like that. But also you can just work it out from the number of other bones and limbs and things in there. I love the way that this is from a homeschool activities worksheet. So you can actually buy owl pellets on the internet and get them delivered, or go out and find them yourselves. And then you can spend some time digging through the pellets and having a look at what the owls have been eating and what you might find inside them. It's really interesting and great fun. Right, so I talked a little bit, well, we just saw there about jackdaws and their pellets. These are absolutely classic castle ruin animals. There's loads around Kirkstall Abbey. They're really gregarious. They're of the crow family, so the type of crow that you will see them wheeling around and messing around. You know, almost without fail, you'll be looking up and see the jackdaws on Kirkstall Abbey. They sort of they make the kind of chuck 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 noise. Not much of a jackdaw, but they're quite distinctive. And also, if you get anywhere near them, they're the only crow you can see. They've got a straight white iris in their eyes, so a grey hood and then a white iris. They're pretty distinct. The 2 other things you might spot are the big black crows, so they're completely black, black eyes, black beaks. And then the rooks, which have sort of, I mean, bless them, I do think they're the ugliest ones. So they've got sort of a not particularly attractive grey beak, and they're a bit bigger than jackdaws. But the jackdaws are the ones that you'll definitely see around. So I was interested that the word jack actually is a sort of diminutive word. So jack was used as a word for smaller things, like a jack snipe is a smaller snipe, and a jackdaw is a smaller daw or crow. Or so it was used to sort of be a sort of way of making, just saying that something that was smaller. They usually are around trees, cliffs, castles and ruins. They eat seeds, fruit, invertebrates, carrion and food waste. Of course, another reason to be around an abbey is all the people who visit the abbey and leave all their food to be eaten from bins and stuff like that. I really like their collective noun is a clattering of jackdaws. So I thought that was quite nice, because they do sort of clatter around. Okay, yeah, the top left picture is one of the ones in our collection at Leeds. There's a jackdaw that was caught at Kirkstall Abbey in 1937, so they've been doing this for a while. And the other thing that lives at Kirkstall Abbey, and you can go on back walks in the summer, hopefully when we're all back to normal we can start doing that again. So there's a couple of different species that live at Kirkstall. One is the pipistrelle bat, which is the smallest British bat, very, very cute. They're only little tiny things, and they specialise obviously on insects, echolocating to find things to eat. They love the abbey because it provides so many roosting spots, so they can go and find a nice quiet little nook or cranny to squirrel themselves into. in the daytime so that they can then be protected, so they can come out at night time, and you'll find them at dusk around the Abbey. And then also the other bats that's been spotted at Abbey and at Kirkstall Abbey, and there may be more, but I certainly know this one, is the noctule. And noctules are much more chunkier bats. They're sort of this kind of size. You can see. So I don't know, 10 centimeters long, maybe a bit longer. And they look so much more robust and sort of meatier than the pipistrelles. So noctules are specialists at hunting over water. So obviously having the wide river ooze. Oh my goodness, sorry, I live in York, can you tell? The River Aire going past Kirkstall, and it's lovely and wide. Then the bats will fly low over the water and pick up all sorts of water insects. So they love living at Kirkstall because they've got the roosts in Kirkstall Abbey, and then also they can then go and feed over the water, obviously. There's a lovely little noctule. I think these pictures are all from the Bat Trust because they're all in gloves. Let's have a look at the last one. Yeah, so they're all in people's hands to get good photos of them. So you can see the size of the pipistrelle there, really tiny on those fingertips, and the noctule just a bit more chunky on someone's glove. And then in the summer, well, from about I always think that the swallows come in on about the 23rd of April. I don't know why. I think it's exactly the 23rd. They come on the 23rd of April and leave on the 23rd of September. But then this is actually a swift. So swifts really are summer specialists. They're only interested in arriving here when it's hot and sunny. So there's lots of insects and invertebrates around for them to eat. They arrive, they breed, and then they leave. Their babies actually leave 2 weeks after them. So they leave them in their nests when they're fully grown. And then the baby gets hungry enough 2 weeks later and finally comes out. So the adults are long gone before the babies come out. And swifts are cliff specialists. So they really need a sheltered, covered little nook or cranny sometimes in people's houses, but also in places like Kirkstall Abbey to breed. And they have one chick in a nest, and they will stay all summer and then carry on south after that. Swifts, I always think, are really easy to recognise. I mean, some of the martins and everything, it's a bit difficult to tell against a sunny sky what exactly you're looking at. But the swifts they're big, but also they're sickle shaped. They've got these beautiful sickles flying through the air. So if you've got anything with this great big curve on it, then that's a swift. They are called, their Latin or their scientific name is apodidae, and that APOD means without POD, feet. And they did used to think that they just never landed and they didn't have any feet, because if you get a swift that's grounded, they actually can't, they haven't got the spring in their legs to get up again, so they never land on the ground. They only ever dive off Abbeys. And so you'll never see them on the ground, but also they're flying around screaming. They do scream, especially sort of early evening. You see sort of sets of them in high summer running around, flying around screaming. And they do that as a sort of bonding activity, but also all that flying around, they're actually mainly eating spiders, believe it or not. One of their main food sources are baby spiders on their lengths of silk. They're ballooning baby spiders. There's so many in the atmosphere that the swifts generally get a good meal out of all the ballooning spiders. But it does need to be pretty hot and sunny for all that to be happening. So they're only here in the summer mainly. Love a swift. And of course, from the sublime to the ridiculous, this is actually a rock dove. It's a proper pigeon in its proper place, which is on a sea cliff. And rock doves are the same as feral pigeons. There's been a bit of interbreeding with all the bred racing pigeons that we've produced, but generally rock doves, feral pigeons, same sort of thing. And they are cliff specialists, and they've moved into our towns and cities to take advantage of all our food. Originally it was seed waste from all the horses and everything that were around, but then finally, nowadays they just eat absolutely anything that they get their hands on. And I forgot about my clock. Yes, it's 10 o'clock in the morning. So feral pigeons all across any cliff face, any building, any abbey, anywhere. They absolutely love living on abbeys and castles and railway stations and any other city centre buildings you can imagine. And unfortunately, they do cause quite a lot of problems because their droppings are corrosive. They apparently corrode stone, zinc, copper, and lead. The droppings, when they're dry and you inhale them, that can cause a problem. And also, they're a fantastic source of bacteria. So Salmonella, E. coli, and Campylobacter have all been found in pigeon droppings. How lovely. And so generally, they're a right pain. And not really wanted in the middle of towns or on abbeys, and they'd be much better off on their original rock cliffs. But there we are, that's why we have pigeons everywhere. But then a famous predator of pigeons, something that specializes in eating pigeons, is this bird here, and this is peregrine falcon. Now, it's not just any peregrine falcon. This is one of a pair that nests every year on the Parkinson Tower on Leeds University, sort of on the top of the hill, which is absolutely fantastic. It's brilliant to see them back in towns and cities. They eat the pigeons, but they also scare them away, which has proven really useful because it's very difficult to get rid of pigeons. But if you put a peregrine falcon in the mix, then they can be discouraged from being in the area. So peregrine falcons are absolutely fabulous. They're one of my favourite birds. I always say that you can recognise them because they have these go faster stripes on their face. So if you're wondering what bird you're looking at, they've got these two sort of stripes either side of their beak running down their chin from their eyes. It's a go faster stripe. It's a peregrine falcon, and they are incredibly fast. The way that they hunt is by circling above a pigeon flock. So the pigeons get very upset and riled up and will fly into the sky, and then a peregrine falcon will come out of a clear blue sky, diving at about 180 miles an hour, the fastest thing on the planet, and fastest animal on the planet, diving, and then they hit the pigeons. And a friend of mine saw this once and said the pigeon basically explodes. There's not much left, it's almost instantaneous death from above. They're really incredible predators. And then they take their pigeon back to their nest. As far as I know, they're not nesting on Kirkstall Abbey, but they're certainly nesting on lots of cathedrals around the country. I think with such a concentration of food in a city centre, and also having high buildings like cathedrals around, then you do get peregrine falcons in quite a lot of cities around the UK at the moment, which is great. Now, peregrines are amazing for many reasons, but one of the things that they can do, which I find completely incredible, is breathe while they're going at 180 miles an hour. If you've ever put your head out of a car window, not that you would ever do anything so unsensible, but if you ever put your head out of a car window and tried to breathe as this air is throwing itself at your face, it can be incredibly difficult to get a breath. And so if you're diving at 180 miles per hour, you do need a way of breathing. And if you have a look at this picture of this peregrine's nostrils, they actually have a little baffle inside there which allows them to filter the air or to direct the air so that they can breathe as they're dropping. And it's such a successful way of doing it that the engineers were looking at it for intakes into fighter jets and things like that, and they've been copying the way that the air moves across that nostril so that the fighter jets can have air intake as they're going at supersonic speeds. So they're just wonderful. I love a peregrine falcon. Oh yeah, and then we're going back to Kirkstall Abbey again, because I wanted just to include this lovely species that lives at Kirkstall, which is fantastic to see back. It hasn't been around for many years, but with a big effort to clear up the pollution in rivers and look at habitats for all sorts of different species and fish returning and stuff like that. It means that all the way up the air, including in Leeds city centre, they saw one of these looking at itself in the mirror of a shop or a shop window, and they managed to get a CCTV of it looking at itself in a shop window. And that, of course, is the European otter, which is making its way back up the air to Kirkstall, which is fantastic. Right, thank you very much. I've just listened to myself on my own for a few minutes. It's been very strange, but I'm really looking forward to getting back to normal and seeing everybody in person and doing a proper talk with some questions and answers. But thank you very much for listening. I have to work out how to turn this thing off. See if I can do it.